A boy rushes into a small-town clinic clutching a limp, lifeless cat in his arms. He's desperate for help. But when the vet examines it, the unthinkable happens. An ear-piercing screech fills the room, leaving everyone frozen in shock. The cat isn't just still. It's hiding a secret no one could have imagined. How did it end up here? And why does its past lead to a tangled web of heartbreak, mystery, and redemption? What they uncover will change their lives forever. Don't miss this powerful story of connection, courage, and the second chances that heal us all. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Dr. Marilyn Harper's desk as she sipped her coffee, savoring the quiet moment before her workday began. Her small veterinary clinic in Willow Creek had been her anchor for the past 15 years, especially after losing Tom. The familiar smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of the fish tank in the waiting room brought her comfort. She glanced at her appointment book, just 3 routine checkups scheduled. Mrs. Peterson's elderly poodle needed vaccines, the Thompsons' cat was due for dental work, and little Tommy Baker was bringing in his hamster for a wellness check. Simple, predictable, just the way she liked it. The bell above the door suddenly jangled violently. Marilyn jumped, spilling coffee on her white coat. A small boy burst through the entrance, his face wet with tears, and his arms wrapped tightly around something gray and motionless. "Please," he choked out between sobs. I think it's dead." Marilyn rushed forward, her heart thumping. The boy's dark hair was disheveled, and his school backpack hung awkwardly off one shoulder. She gently guided him to the examination room. "Let's take a look, sweetheart. Put the cat here on the table," she said softly, patting the steel surface. The boy carefully laid down the limp animal, his hands shaking. As Marilyn began her examination, the cat suddenly let out an ear-splitting screech. The boy stumbled backward, hitting the cabinet behind him. His eyes went wide with surprise and relief. "It's alive!" he exclaimed, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Yes, it is," Marilyn said, frowning as she felt the cat's unusually stiff muscles. "I'm Marilyn. What's your name?" "Jacob," he whispered, inching closer to the table. Marilyn grabbed her microchip scanner and ran it over the cat's neck. The device beeped. "Well, look at that. This cat belongs to someone named Adelaide Foster in Millbrook." "Is it going to be okay?" Jacob asked, his voice small. His t-shirt was worn thin at the edges, and Marilyn noticed a small hole near the collar. "Where did you find it, Jacob?" "On Oak Street, by the elementary school. I was walking home and saw it lying there." He fidgeted with his backpack strap. "I couldn't just leave it." Marilyn nodded, noting the unusual symptoms she was observing. "The cat's alive, but something's not quite right. I'd like to keep it overnight for observation." Jacob's shoulders slumped with visible relief. Can I come back tomorrow to check on it?" "Of course you can. I'll try to contact the owner and figure out what's going on." Marilyn watched as Jacob backed toward the door, his eyes still fixed on the cat. "Promise you'll let me know what happens?" "I promise," she said warmly. She stood at the window, watching as Jacob walked away, his backpack bouncing slightly with each step until he disappeared around the corner. Marilyn sat at her desk, staring at the phone number from the microchip registry. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her office as she dialed the number, listening to each ring with growing anticipation. "Hello?" A thin, wavering voice answered. "Mrs. Adelaide Foster? This is Dr. Marilyn Harper from Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic. I'm calling because we found a cat with a microchip registered to you." There was a long pause on the other end. "A cat?" Mrs. Foster's voice trembled. "No, that must be a mistake." "The chip details match perfectly," Marilyn explained gently. It's a gray tabby with white paws. I don't have a cat anymore, Mrs. Foster cut in sharply. Her voice had an edge of panic. You must be mistaken. Marilyn frowned, noting the strange reaction. The records show. The records are old. Please, just leave it alone. The elderly woman's voice cracked with emotion. Before Marilyn could respond, the clinic door chimed. Jacob rushed in, his backpack still on, looking eagerly around the waiting room. I'll need to call you back, Mrs. Foster, Marilyn said, but the line had already gone dead. Dr. Harper, how's the cat? Jacob's eyes were bright with concern. Marilyn led him to the recovery area where the gray tabby lay curled in a soft bed. See for yourself. He's doing much better. Jacob knelt by the cage, carefully extending his fingers through the bars. The cat immediately responded, rubbing against them and purring. Hi, Whiskers, he whispered. Whiskers? Marilyn smiled. Because of his long whiskers, Jacob explained, not taking his eyes off the cat. Can I keep him? Please? I promise I'll take good care of him. Marilyn sat on a nearby stool. Well, we need to sort out where he came from first. There's someone who might be his owner. Jacob's face fell. Oh. He continued petting the cat, his shoulders slumping. It gets really quiet at home. Mom works at the diner until late, and sometimes she picks up extra shifts. I do my homework, but... His voice trailed off. Marilyn watched as Whiskers pressed his head against Jacob's hand, purring louder. The boy's gentle touch and the cat's immediate trust spoke volumes. You live just with your mom? Marilyn asked softly. Jacob nodded, still focused on Whiskers. Since last year. Mom says we had to move here for a fresh start. His voice was barely a whisper. Marilyn's heart ached as she observed the clear bond forming between boy and cat. She thought back to Mrs. Foster's strange reaction, tucking that puzzle away for later investigation. Tell you what, she said, Whiskers needs to stay here a few more days while I figure things out. Would you like to come visit him after school? Jacob's face lit up. Really? You'd let me? Of course. He seems to like you very much. After Jacob left, Marilyn returned to her desk and pulled up the microchip records again. Something wasn't adding up, and she was determined to uncover the truth behind Mrs. Foster's unusual response. Marilyn settled into her favorite armchair, wrapping her fingers around a warm cup of chamomile tea. The soft glow of her table lamp cast shadows across the living room walls. Nearby, Whiskers dozed in the carrier, occasionally twitching in his sleep. Her mind wandered back to Jacob's visits. Those sad eyes, the way his shoulders hunched forward. It all struck a familiar chord. Memories she'd tucked away years ago began to surface. I was just like him, she whispered to herself, remembering the hollow feeling after losing her parents in a car accident when she was 12. The loneliness had been overwhelming back then. She'd spent countless hours hiding in her room at her aunt's house, afraid to let anyone see her pain. Placing her tea on the side table, Marilyn opened her laptop. Something about Mrs. Foster's reaction to the cat didn't sit right. She pulled up the microchip registry website and logged in with her veterinary credentials. The records showed strange patterns. The chip had been registered to Mrs. Foster only 3 months ago, but the manufacture date was much older. Even more peculiar was an update to the registration that coincided with a date that caught her eye, March 15th. That's odd, Marilyn muttered, opening a new tab. A quick search brought up local news reports from that same week. Her heart sank as she read the headlines. String of pet thefts rocks neighboring counties. The article mentioned several cats stolen from their homes, leaving devastated families behind. Across town, Jacob pushed open the door to his house. The kitchen light was on, but barely illuminated the cramped space. His mother, Sarah, stood at the counter, still in her waitress uniform, mindlessly stirring a cup of instant coffee. "Hi, Mom," Jacob said quietly. Sarah glanced up, dark circles under her eyes. "There's some mac and cheese in the microwave," she mumbled, before turning back to her coffee. Jacob grabbed the bowl and retreated to his small bedroom. Sitting on his bed, surrounded by unpacked moving boxes, he picked at his food. The house felt emptier than usual tonight. He thought about Whiskers, remembering how the cat's fur felt under his fingers. For those few moments at the clinic, the heavy feeling in his chest had lifted. Back in her living room, Marilyn's fingers flew across the keyboard as she dug deeper into the records. Each new detail added another piece to a troubling puzzle. She remembered Jacob's hopeful expression when he asked about keeping Whiskers, and her heart ached with understanding. She knew what it was like to need something, anything, to hold on to when your world felt like it was falling apart. The morning sun streamed through the clinic windows as Marilyn dialed Jacob's number. Her heart warmed at the excitement in his voice when she invited him over. Within 20 minutes, he burst through the door, his cheeks flushed from running. "Is Whiskers okay?" he asked, catching his breath. "See for yourself." Marilyn gestured to the cat carrier where Whiskers lay curled up. Jacob's face lit up as he approached the carrier. Whiskers meowed softly, recognizing him. Marilyn watched as the boy's shoulders relaxed, tension melting away. "Would you like to learn how to take care of a cat?" Marilyn asked, pulling out some supplies. Jacob nodded eagerly. She showed him how to brush Whiskers' fur with gentle strokes, explaining how it helped prevent tangles. "Like this?" he asked, carefully mimicking her movements. "Perfect," she smiled. "Now, let's talk about feeding." As they worked together, measuring food portions and discussing feeding schedules, Jacob's usual reserve began to fade. His voice grew softer as he shared his story. "Dad got sick last year," he said, his fingers buried in Whiskers' fur. "The doctors tried everything, but—" his words trailed off. "Mom works all the time now, sometimes at the diner, sometimes cleaning houses." Marilyn's heart ached as Jacob described empty afternoons in their small rental house, doing homework alone while his mother worked double shifts. The weight of his loss showed in his hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. "Whiskers," Jacob said suddenly, scratching behind the cat's ears. "That's his official name now. Is that okay?" "It's perfect," Marilyn assured him. "Why did you choose it?" "Because of these," Jacob smiled, gently touching the cat's long whiskers. "And because, well, it feels like he's meant to be mine, like he found me when I needed someone." Marilyn watched as Jacob continued grooming Whiskers, noting how naturally they connected. The cat purred contentedly, completely at ease with the boy's touch. It was clear that both of them had found something they desperately needed: companionship. When it was time to leave, Jacob lingered by the carrier. "Can I come back tomorrow?" "Of course," Marilyn said, walking him to the door. She watched him head down the street, his steps lighter than when he'd arrived. Standing in the doorway, Marilyn's mind was already working on her next steps. She needed to visit Mrs. Foster and uncover the truth about Whiskers' past. The boy's happiness might depend on it. Marilyn's car hummed quietly as she drove through the autumn morning. Her thoughts drifted to Jacob's bright eyes when he played with Whiskers, then to Mrs. Foster's strange phone call. The GPS guided her through unfamiliar streets until she reached a small house with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the cracked concrete path and knocked on the door. After a long pause, it creaked open. Mrs. Foster stood there, thin and pale, her silver hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her hands clutched the door frame as if for support. "Yes?" Her voice quivered. "Mrs. Foster, I'm Dr. Harper. We spoke on the phone about the cat." Mrs. Foster's eyes darted nervously. I suppose you'd better come in." The living room was neat but worn, with faded photographs on the walls and threadbare furniture. Mrs. Foster lowered herself into an old armchair, her movements slow and careful. "The cat," Marilyn began gently, "has a microchip registered to this address." Mrs. Foster's hands trembled in her lap. Yes, that would be my Whiskers." Her voice cracked. "My son Tommy. He took him 3 months ago. I haven't seen either of them since." Tears welled up in her tired eyes. "Tommy's been struggling with drugs for years. He's taken everything he could sell." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I tried so hard to help him, but nothing worked. And now I'm too tired to start over with Whiskers." Marilyn leaned forward, her voice soft. "Mrs. Foster, I want you to know that Whiskers is safe. He's being well cared for at my clinic." That's good." Mrs. Foster's shoulders slumped. "Sometimes I wonder where I went wrong with Tommy. All those years of trying to get him help, watching him slip away." Her hands shook harder as she reached for another tissue. "The worst part is not knowing where he is, if he's alive or—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marilyn noticed the woman's exhaustion in every movement, every hesitation. The weight of years of worry had left deep lines on her face. "I'll keep you updated about Whiskers," Marilyn promised, standing to leave. "We'll figure this out together." Mrs. Foster walked her to the door, her steps unsteady. As Marilyn drove away, she glimpsed the elderly woman in a rearview mirror, a lonely figure in the doorway, small against the faded house. The image stayed with her as she headed back to her clinic, her heart heavy with the burden of Mrs. Foster's pain. The evening sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Jacob helped Marilyn organize supplies. His small hands worked carefully, arranging cotton balls and bandages just as she'd shown him. Whiskers watched from a nearby perch, tail swishing contentedly. "You're good at this, Jacob," Marilyn said, noting his careful attention to detail. Jacob's face brightened at the praise. "I like helping the animals." He paused, then added softly, "It's better than being at home alone." Marilyn handed him a scoop of cat food. "Tell me about home, Jacob." As he filled the food bowls, Jacob's shoulders slumped slightly. "Mom leaves really early, sometimes before I wake up. She works at the diner for breakfast shift, then goes to her second job at the grocery store." "That must be hard," Marilyn said gently, watching his expression. Jacob nodded, his voice quiet. "She's usually not back until after dinner. I make my own sandwiches and stuff." He stroked Whiskers, who had wandered over. "That's why I like coming here. It doesn't feel so empty." Marilyn's heart ached at his words. She watched as Jacob methodically cleaned each cage, taking extra care with the animals inside. An idea formed in her mind. "Jacob," she said, "how would you like a job here after school?" His eyes widened. "A real job?" "Nothing too complicated, helping with feeding, cleaning, and keeping the animals company. But yes, a real job with real responsibilities." Jacob's whole face lit up with joy. "Really? You mean it?"
"I do. We could use the help, and you clearly have a way with the animals."
"Yes, thank you," Jacob exclaimed, then caught himself and added more professionally, "I mean, I accept the position." Marilyn smiled at his attempt at formality. They spent the next hour going over simple tasks and basic rules. Jacob absorbed everything eagerly, asking thoughtful questions and taking his new responsibilities seriously. As the day drew to a close, Jacob gathered his backpack. "Thank you, Dr. Harper. I'll be back tomorrow right after school." "Looking forward to it," Marilyn replied, watching as he headed toward the door. Jacob turned back one last time. "Thank you for trusting me," he said softly, then disappeared into the evening light. The afternoon sun warmed the clinic's waiting room as the bell above the door chimed. Jacob's mother, Sarah, stepped inside, her work uniform wrinkled and her dark hair hastily pulled back. Deep shadows lingered under her eyes, and her shoulders sagged with visible exhaustion. Despite her weary appearance, she managed a polite smile. "Hi, I'm Sarah, Jacob's mom," she said, her voice carrying the strain of someone running on empty. "Sorry I'm late." Marilyn stepped forward, extending her hand. "Dr. Harper, it's wonderful to finally meet you." Jacob emerged from the back room, whiskers cradled in his arms. His eyes darted between his mother and Marilyn, his fingers nervously stroking the cat's fur. "How are you managing?" Marilyn asked gently. "Moving to a new town can be challenging." Sarah shifted her weight, checking her watch. "Oh, we're fine. Getting settled in." Her tone was dismissive, closing the door on further conversation. "Mom," Jacob spoke up, his voice small but eager. "Dr. Harper offered me a part-time job here after school. I can help with the animals and earn some money." Sarah's expression flickered between surprise and relief. "A job?" She glanced at Marilyn. That's actually good, as long as it doesn't affect his schoolwork." "Of course not," Marilyn assured her. "Just a few hours after school, helping with basic tasks." "Well, we need to go," Sarah said, checking her watch again. "I'm already late for my shift at the diner." She gestured to Jacob. "Come on, honey." Jacob carefully placed Whiskers back in his cage, his movements reluctant. Sarah was already heading for the door, her steps quick and anxious. "Thank you, Dr. Harper," she called over her shoulder. "We appreciate this opportunity." Jacob hurried after his mother, throwing one last glance at Marilyn before the door closed behind them. Through the window, Marilyn watched them walk to their car. Sarah's stride rushed and tense, Jacob trying to keep up with her pace. Marilyn stood in the quiet clinic, processing the brief but revealing interaction. Sarah's exhaustion went beyond physical tiredness. It spoke of deeper struggles and emotional burdens she wasn't ready to share. The evening settled over Willow Creek as Marilyn sat at her desk, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She spread out Mrs. Foster's paperwork under her desk lamp, hoping to find anything that might help make sense of the situation. Her eyes caught something in the margin of an old vaccination record, a hastily scrawled phone number. Marilyn's fingers hovered over her phone. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as she debated whether to make the call. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the number. After 3 rings, a man's voice answered, rough and defensive. "Yeah? Who's this?" "This is Dr. Harper from Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic. I'm calling about a cat that belonged to Adelaide Foster." There was a long pause. "What about it?" "The cat was found recently. I believe you might know something about what happened to it." "Look, lady," the man's voice hardened. "Whatever my mother told you, I'm just trying to understand the situation." Marilyn kept her voice calm and professional. Another pause, followed by a heavy sigh. "Fine. Yeah, I took the cat. Sold it to some guy passing through town. Needed the money, all right? That's all there is to it." His casual admission and lack of remorse made Marilyn's jaw tighten. "I see. That's it? No lecture?" "Would it make any difference?" Marilyn asked quietly. "Nah, guess not." His tone was dismissive. "We done here." Marilyn ended the call shortly after, setting her phone down carefully. The silence in her office felt heavy. She thought about Mrs. Foster's trembling hands, her son's hardened voice, and then about Jacob, another child caught in the ripples of adult decisions. She looked at the photo of Whiskers on her desk, taken just that afternoon while Jacob was playing with him, the cat that had unknowingly connected so many broken pieces of different lives. Mrs. Foster's pain echoed Jacob's in ways that made Marilyn's heart ache, both victims of circumstances beyond their control, both searching for something to hold on to. Marilyn sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of everything she'd learned. The son's admission had answered one question, but opened up so many others. She glanced at Mrs. Foster's address again, thinking about the lonely woman in that aging house, and then about Jacob, who found such joy in caring for the very creature his family had cast aside. Early morning sunlight streamed through the clinic windows as Jacob pushed open the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The familiar jingle of the bell announced his arrival, and Whiskers perked up from his bed in the corner, tail twitching with recognition. "Good morning," Marilyn said warmly, measuring out cat food into a bowl. "You're here bright and early." "I wanted to see Whiskers before school," Jacob replied, dropping his backpack and kneeling beside the cat. His gentle hand stroked the soft fur as Whiskers purred contentedly. Marilyn watched them for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Jacob, there's something I need to tell you about Whiskers." The boy looked up, his eyes suddenly worried. "Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong with Whiskers," Marilyn assured him, pulling up a chair. "But I've learned more about where he came from. Remember Mrs. Foster, the woman listed on his microchip?" Jacob nodded, his hand still resting protectively on the cat's back. "I visited her yesterday," Marilyn continued carefully. "She's an elderly lady who's been through some tough times. Her son—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He took Whiskers and sold him without her permission because he needed money." Jacob's eyes widened. "He stole his own mom's cat?" "Yes," Marilyn said softly. "And Mrs. Foster isn't well enough to take care of Whiskers anymore. She's quite frail and lonely." Jacob's face scrunched up with concern. "That's really sad." "I was thinking," Marilyn said, "would you like to come with me to visit Mrs. Foster this afternoon? We could talk to her together about Whiskers, and you could hear her story yourself." Jacob bit his lip, uncertainty crossing his face. "Will she be mad at me for having her cat?" "No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. In fact, you helped save Whiskers when you found him." Marilyn reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "Sometimes doing the right thing means facing difficult situations. I'll be right there with you." After a moment's hesitation, Jacob nodded. "Okay, I'll go." "That's very brave of you," Marilyn smiled, pride warming her heart. "We'll figure this out together." Jacob gave Whiskers one final pat before standing up and retrieving his backpack. "I better get to school," he said, heading toward the door. Marilyn watched him leave, touched by his willingness to face this challenging situation. As the bell chimed his departure, she began mentally preparing for their afternoon visit to Mrs. Foster. The autumn sun was setting as Marilyn's car pulled into Mrs. Foster's driveway. Jacob sat quietly in the passenger seat, his fingers wrapped tightly around a small paper bag of cat treats. His knee bounced nervously as he stared at the aging house. "You ready?" Marilyn asked gently. Jacob nodded, though his grip on the bag tightened. "What if she's mad at me for keeping Whiskers?" "She won't be," Marilyn assured him, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Sometimes doing the right thing takes courage." They walked up the cracked concrete path to Mrs. Foster's front door. The doorbell chimed faintly inside. After a long moment, they heard slow footsteps approaching. Mrs. Foster opened the door cautiously, her thin frame wrapped in a worn cardigan. When she saw Jacob, her stern expression softened. "Oh, you must be the boy who found my cat," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, ma'am," Jacob replied quietly. "I brought these." He held out the bag of treats. "They're Whisker's favorite." Mrs. Foster's eyes welled up as she invited them inside. The living room was neat but showed signs of age. Faded wallpaper, well-worn furniture, and dozens of framed photos on the walls. They settled onto an old floral couch while Mrs. Foster lowered herself into a recliner. "I found him by the road," Jacob began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "He wasn't moving at first, and I was scared he was—" He swallowed hard. "But Dr. Harper helped him, and now he's doing really good." Mrs. Foster dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I love that cat so much," she whispered. "When Tommy, my son, when he took him—" Her voice cracked. "I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find him." "Your son has been struggling for a long time, hasn't he?" Marilyn asked softly. Mrs. Foster nodded, more tears falling. "The drugs changed him. He used to be such a sweet boy. But now—" She gestured to a photo on the wall showing a young man with bright eyes and a wide smile. "He takes things, sells them, even Whiskers." She covered her face with trembling hands. Jacob watched her, his own eyes growing wet. He thought about his mother, working endless hours, trying so hard to keep their family together. He recognized the same pain in Mrs. Foster's face that he sometimes saw in his mom's. "Whiskers helped me not feel so alone," Mrs. Foster continued, wiping her eyes. "After Tommy left, that cat was all I had. But now," she looked at Jacob with a gentle smile, "I'm glad he found someone who loves him as much as I did." Jacob's lower lip trembled. "He makes me feel less alone, too." Mrs. Foster reached out and patted his hand. "Then maybe this is how it was meant to be. Maybe Whiskers can bring you the same comfort he brought me." The afternoon sun streamed through the clinic windows as Jacob organized medical supplies on the shelves. His movements were precise and careful, a far cry from his hesitant first days at the clinic. A week had passed since he'd started helping after school, and already the change in him was visible. "That's perfect, Jacob," Marilyn said, watching him sort the gauze packages by size. "You're getting really good at this." Jacob beamed at the praise. "I remembered how you showed me last time." He reached for another box, then paused. "Dr. Harper, can I ask you something about cat medicine?" "Of course." Marilyn smiled, noting how his curiosity had grown stronger each day. "Well, when Whiskers needs his medicine, how do you know exactly how much to give him?" Jacob's eyes were bright with genuine interest. Marilyn pulled out a small scale and some measuring tools. "Here, let me show you." She demonstrated the proper way to measure medication, explaining each step carefully. Jacob absorbed every word, asking thoughtful questions. As they worked together, Jacob's shoulders gradually relaxed. "Mom had to pick up another shift at the diner," he said quietly, organizing cotton swabs. "She won't be home until really late again." Marilyn's heart ached, but she kept her voice steady. "That must be hard for both of you." "Yeah," Jacob stroked Whiskers, who had wandered over to investigate their work. "Sometimes she's so tired she falls asleep right after dinner. I try to be quiet so she can rest." "That's very considerate of you," Marilyn said gently. "You know, helping here at the clinic. That's another way you're making things easier for your mom." Jacob looked up. "Really?" "Absolutely. You're learning responsibility, helping others, and growing stronger every day. Those are things that make a parent proud." Tears welled up in Jacob's eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. "I just want to help somehow. At home, I feel stuck." "You're doing more than you know," Marilyn assured him. She handed him a fresh towel to fold. "Now, want to learn how to prepare tomorrow's surgery kits?" Jacob's face lit up. "Can I really?" As they worked together through the afternoon, Marilyn watched Jacob's confidence grow with each completed task. He moved through the clinic with increasing sureness, checking on the animals, asking intelligent questions about their care, and taking pride in his work. When closing time approached, Jacob stood in the middle of the spotless treatment room, surveying his work with satisfaction. A genuine smile spread across his face, not the hesitant one from his first days, but a real joy-filled expression that reached his eyes. Marilyn felt her own heart lift at the sight. The transformation in just 1 week was remarkable. Where once stood a withdrawn, anxious boy, she now saw glimpses of a confident young person beginning to emerge. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Marilyn finished updating patient records. Jacob sat cross-legged on the floor, gently brushing whiskers while humming softly. The peaceful scene shattered when the front door burst open with a bang. A tall man with disheveled clothes and wild eyes stormed in. "Where's Dr. Harper?" he demanded, his voice rough and angry. Jacob's brush clattered to the floor. He instinctively pulled Whiskers closer to his chest, his small hands trembling. Marilyn recognized the man immediately from Mrs. Foster's photos, her son. "I'm Dr. Harper," Marilyn said calmly, stepping between Jacob and the man. Her heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "How can I help you?" "That cat," he jabbed a finger toward Whiskers. "It's mine. You had no right to take it." "That's not true," Marilyn replied firmly. "We both know how you obtained Whiskers, and the authorities are already aware of the situation." The man's face reddened. "I don't care what my mother told you. I sold that cat fair and square. You're the one stealing." Jacob pressed himself against the wall, clutching Whiskers tighter. Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't make a sound. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Marilyn said, her voice steel-edged but controlled. "The police have been notified about the theft. If you continue to harass us, they'll be involved again." The man kicked a nearby chair, making Jacob jump. "This isn't over!" he shouted, then stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Marilyn immediately locked the door and pulled out her phone. "Hello, police department? Yes, this is Dr. Harper at the veterinary clinic." She quickly explained the situation while keeping a watchful eye on Jacob. After ending the call, she knelt beside the frightened boy. "The police will make sure he stays away, Jacob. You're safe here." "I was so scared," Jacob whispered, his voice shaky. "What if he comes back and takes Whiskers?" Marilyn gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy," she explained softly. "People might try to intimidate us or make us doubt ourselves. But standing up for what's right, protecting those who need our help, that's what makes us strong." Jacob looked up at her, his eyes still wet but showing a glimmer of understanding. "Like how you stood up to him." "Exactly," Marilyn smiled. "Being brave doesn't mean not feeling afraid. It means doing what's right, even when we are afraid." As the day drew to a close, Marilyn sat with Jacob in the quiet clinic. Whiskers purred contentedly in his lap, seemingly unaware of the earlier drama. "Everything will be okay," she assured him, watching as some of the tension left his shoulders. "We'll get through this together." Jacob hesitated at the clinic door, scanning the street nervously before slipping inside. Marilyn greeted him warmly, assuring him the police were keeping an eye on the area and new security cameras were installed. Despite the reassurances, Jacob's anxiety lingered. While cleaning kennels, Jacob expressed guilt about keeping Whiskers, feeling as though he was taking something away from Mrs. Foster. Marilyn shared her own story of loss, explaining that love and kindness add to the world rather than take away. She reminded him that doing the right thing often feels complicated, but is worth it. Gradually, Jacob's confidence grew, and by evening he walked taller, reassured by Marilyn's wisdom. Sarah stormed into the clinic, worried Jacob was spending too much time there and neglecting his responsibilities. In a private conversation, she admitted feeling inadequate as a mother due to her long work hours. Marilyn gently reassured her that the clinic was a safe space for Jacob, helping him build confidence and responsibility. Marilyn emphasized that Jacob often spoke proudly of Sarah's hard work, and the clinic was a way to support both of them. Sarah, moved by Marilyn's compassion, softened, though she left still grappling with her emotions. Jacob's cheerful afternoon took a disastrous turn when Whiskers escaped from an improperly latched enclosure. Realizing the mistake, Jacob panicked, searching every corner of the clinic while blaming himself for the oversight. Marilyn comforted him, emphasizing that accidents happen and assuring him they'd find Whiskers. They planned to make posters and alert the community. Jacob left for home, guilt-ridden, as Marilyn immediately began organizing the search, determined to bring Whiskers back. The morning sun had barely risen when Marilyn started making calls. Her first was to the local print shop, where Tom, the owner, agreed to print flyers for free as soon as she sent the photos. Within an hour, her email inbox filled with messages from neighbors offering to help search. "We'll find Whiskers," Marilyn assured Jacob as he arrived at the clinic, his eyes red from crying. "Look how many people want to help." She showed him the growing stack of printed flyers featuring Whiskers' photo. The description read, "Lost cat, gray and white, green eyes, responds to Whiskers. Last seen at Harper Veterinary Clinic." They split into teams. Mrs. Chen from the bakery took the east side of town. The Roberts family covered the park. Even grumpy Mr. Peterson volunteered to search his large property behind the clinic. Jacob and Marilyn walked together, stopping anyone they saw. Each time someone shook their head, Jacob's shoulders slumped a little more. "I should have checked the latch," he whispered, kicking at a stone on the sidewalk. "Mistakes happen," Marilyn said softly. "What matters is how we fix them. Look at all these people helping us. They care because they see how much you care." They passed Sarah's diner, where the owner taped their flyer in the window without hesitation. The hardware store did the same. At the grocery store, the manager promised to tell all his customers. By late afternoon, their feet ached from walking. They stopped to rest on a bench outside the market when Mr. Garcia, who owned the small convenience store across the street, rushed over. "Dr. Harper," he called out, slightly out of breath. "I think I saw your cat this morning. Gray and white, right? It was in the alley behind my store, near the old boxes." Jacob jumped up, his eyes wide with hope. "Really? When? Was he okay?" "About 2 hours ago. Looked healthy enough, just scared maybe. Ran away when I tried to get closer." Marilyn squeezed Jacob's shoulder. "It's getting dark now, but first thing tomorrow, we'll check that alley. Cats often stay in the same area when they're lost." They headed back to the clinic, tired but with renewed purpose. The setting sun painted the sky orange as community members called and texted updates about their searches. No one had found Whiskers yet, but the support was overwhelming. "I can't believe everyone's helping us look," Jacob said, his voice filled with wonder. "That's what community means," Marilyn replied. "When someone needs help, we come together. Tomorrow morning, we'll follow Mr. Garcia's lead. For now, get some rest. Whiskers needs us at our best." The phone's shrill ring pierced the early morning quiet of Marilyn's clinic. Sarah's voice trembled on the other end, thick with tears. "Jacob's gone. He didn't come home last night. I checked his room this morning and—" Her voice cracked. "His bed hasn't been slept in." Marilyn's heart squeezed. "Try to stay calm, Sarah. I'll be right there and we'll find him together." Within minutes, Marilyn pulled up to Sarah's house. The morning air was crisp, and Sarah stood waiting on the porch, wringing her hands. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair disheveled. They started their search at the school playground, where a janitor shook his head when shown Jacob's photo. At the corner store, the owner hadn't seen him either. With each empty lead, Sarah's shoulders slumped further. As they walked toward the park, Sarah broke down. "I've been so wrapped up in work, in surviving." She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. "I didn't see how much he was hurting. When he talked about that cat, I just saw it as one more thing to worry about. I should have listened." Marilyn squeezed Sarah's arm. "You're doing the best you can." "Am I?" Sarah's voice cracked. "My son is missing, and I didn't even notice how important Whiskers was to him. What kind of mother does that make me?" They rounded the corner to the small neighborhood park. There, curled up on a wooden bench, was Jacob. His small frame was hunched over, and in his hands, he clutched one of Whiskers' toys, a small mouse made of yarn. Marilyn approached slowly, her footsteps soft on the dewy grass. She sat beside him, keeping a gentle distance. "We've been worried about you, Jacob." He looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I lost him. It's all my fault." "Everyone makes mistakes," Marilyn said softly. "What matters isn't the mistake. It's how we handle it afterward. And running away isn't the answer." Sarah stepped forward, her own tears falling. "I'm so sorry, honey. I should have been there for you more." Jacob looked up at his mother, his lower lip trembling. Marilyn watched as Sarah knelt in front of her son, opening her arms. After a moment's hesitation, Jacob fell into them, sobbing. "Let's head back to the clinic," Marilyn suggested gently. "Together, we'll figure out how to find Whiskers." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the market street as Marilyn parked her car. Jacob fidgeted in the back seat, his eyes scanning every corner for signs of Whiskers. Sarah sat quietly beside him, her hand occasionally reaching out to squeeze his shoulder. "The shop owner said he saw a cat that looks like Whiskers right down this alley," Marilyn explained, pointing to a narrow passage between two brick buildings. They walked slowly into the alley, their footsteps echoing off the walls. Empty boxes and wooden crates lined both sides, creating perfect hiding spots for a scared cat. The smell of fish from the market's back door mixed with the musty scent of cardboard. "Whiskers?" Jacob called softly, his voice trembling. "Here, kitty." Sarah moved some boxes, peering behind them. "We'll find him, honey," she said, her voice gentler than usual. For an hour, they searched every corner. Jacob's hope started to fade until Marilyn noticed movement behind a stack of wooden crates near the back of the alley. "Wait," she whispered, holding up her hand. "Look there." Two green eyes glowed in the shadows. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out one of Whiskers' favorite treats. His hand shook as he held it out. "It's okay, Whiskers. It's just me." The cat crept forward slowly, Whiskers twitching. As it emerged into the light, they could see the familiar white patch on its chest. "It's him!" Jacob whispered excitedly. Whiskers recognized Jacob's voice and darted toward him. Jacob scooped the cat into his arms, and Whiskers immediately started purring, pressing his head against Jacob's chin. Sarah watched her son cradle the cat, tears forming in her eyes. She saw the pure joy on Jacob's face, something she hadn't seen since before his father died. The way Whiskers snuggled into Jacob's arms, completely trusting and content, made her understand just how special their bond was. "Let's get him back to the clinic," Marilyn suggested, smiling at the reunion. Jacob nodded, still holding Whiskers close as they walked back to the car. Morning light streamed through the clinic windows as Marilyn tidied up, preparing for an important meeting. Her heart felt full, knowing that today might bring closure to everyone involved with Whiskers' story. Sarah and Jacob arrived first, the boy's eyes bright with anticipation. He immediately went to Whiskers' cage, gently scratching the cat's ears through the bars. Sarah watched her son with a soft smile, something Marilyn hadn't seen before. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Foster entered, her thin frame wrapped in a worn cardigan. She moved slowly, but her eyes lit up at the sight of Whiskers. "Oh, there you are," she whispered, approaching the cage. Whiskers meowed in recognition, pressing against the bars. Mrs. Foster's hands trembled as she reached out to stroke the cat's fur. "Jacob," Mrs. Foster said, turning to face the boy, "I've been thinking a lot about Whiskers. I'm not as strong as I used to be, and my home is too quiet now." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Would you like to keep him?" Jacob's mouth fell open. "Really? You mean it?" Mrs. Foster nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I can see how much you love him. He needs someone young and caring to give him a good life." "I promise I'll take the very best care of him," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll brush him every day and make sure he gets the best food." Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Thank you, Mrs. Foster. And Marilyn." She took a deep breath. "Thank you for showing me what Jacob needed. I've been so focused on working that I forgot about the important things." Marilyn saw an opening and spoke gently. "You know, I know some wonderful people who help families talk through difficult times. They could help you both process everything that's happened." Sarah's eyes welled up, but she nodded. "I think we'd like that, wouldn't we, Jacob?" Jacob leaned against his mother, and she wrapped her arm around him. Whiskers watched from his cage, purring loudly in the emotional moment. Mrs. Foster smiled through her tears. "It makes my heart happy knowing Whiskers will have such a loving home." The elderly woman gave Whiskers one final pat before turning toward the door. Her steps were slow but purposeful, like someone who had finally found peace with a difficult decision. Sarah and Jacob followed, the promise of a fresh start evident in their joined hands and matching smiles. Marilyn watched them go, her heart full of joy at seeing how love for a simple cat had brought healing to so many hearts. Colorful streamers and balloons decorated Marilyn's clinic as people gathered for the special celebration. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows, making Whiskers' fur shine as he lounged contentedly in Jacob's arms. "Welcome, everyone," Marilyn said, her voice full of warmth. "We're here today to celebrate something truly special." The small crowd, clinic staff, neighbors, and those who helped search for Whiskers, gathered around as Jacob stepped forward. His chest puffed with pride as he held Whiskers. "This is Whiskers," Jacob announced, his voice stronger than Marilyn had ever heard it. "He's going to be our clinic mascot because he shows that everyone deserves a second chance." Whiskers purred loudly, as if agreeing with Jacob's words, making everyone laugh. Marilyn stepped to the center of the room. "Sometimes the smallest things can change our lives in the biggest ways," she began. "Whiskers came to us by chance, but he's brought so much more than just himself. He's brought hope, healing, and new friendships." Sarah, standing near Jacob, wiped tears from her eyes before speaking. "I want to thank Marilyn," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't just help Whiskers. You helped my family find our way back to each other." Mrs. Foster sat quietly in a corner chair, watching the scene with misty eyes and a gentle smile. She nodded approvingly as Jacob showed off Whiskers' new collar, complete with a small badge declaring him the official clinic mascot. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter as people shared treats and stories. Children took turns petting Whiskers, who who seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. Jacob beamed as he told everyone about his job helping at the clinic and caring for the animals. Marilyn observed the scene before her: Jacob's confident smile, Sarah's relaxed posture, Mrs. Foster's peaceful expression, and all the community members who had come together. In that moment, she felt the power of how one small cat had created such meaningful change in all their lives. Morning sunlight streamed through the clinic windows as Marilyn poured 2 cups of coffee. Sarah sat across from her at the small desk, her hands fidgeting nervously with her cup. "Thank you for coming in today," Marilyn said softly. "I wanted to talk about something that might help you and Jacob." Sarah's shoulders tensed. "What do you mean?" "Have you ever considered therapy?" Marilyn kept her voice gentle. "For both you and Jacob, it could help you work through your grief together." Sarah's eyes dropped to her coffee. "I don't know. We're managing." "You know," Marilyn said, taking a thoughtful sip, "after I lost my husband, I thought I could handle everything on my own, too. I was wrong." Sarah looked up, surprise crossing her tired features. "You went to therapy." "I did. It helped me understand that asking for help isn't weakness. It's strength." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "Since Tom died, I can't seem to connect with Jacob anymore. I work so much, and when I'm home, I'm exhausted. Sometimes I can barely look at him because he reminds me so much of his father." "That must be incredibly hard," Marilyn said, sliding a tissue box closer. "It is," Sarah whispered, dabbing at her eyes. "I know Jacob needs me, but I feel stuck, like I'm watching our relationship slip away and I don't know how to fix it." "There are people who can help you both navigate this," Marilyn said. "I know a wonderful therapist who specializes in family grief counseling. She offers evening sessions that could work with your schedule." Sarah twisted the tissue in her hands. "You really think it could help?" "I do. And there are other small steps we could take too. Maybe Jacob could do his homework here at the clinic some evenings, and you could join him for dinner when you finish your first job. Even an hour together could make a difference." Sarah nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I'd like that. I miss him, really being there with him, not just in the same house." "It's never too late to start rebuilding," Marilyn said, reaching across to squeeze Sarah's hand. Sarah squeezed back, taking a deep breath. "Okay, I'll call the therapist. And thank you, Marilyn, for everything." When Sarah stood to leave, her posture was straighter, as if a weight had begun to lift. Marilyn watched her walk to her car, hoping this would be the beginning of healing for both mother and son. Marilyn sat at her desk early one morning, surrounded by notepads filled with ideas. Whiskers lounged nearby, purring contentedly as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window. The cat's presence reminded her of how one small act of kindness had changed so many lives. "There must be more children like Jacob out there," she murmured, tapping her pen against the desk. She reached for her phone and called Susan, the leader of her church group. "What if we created a program for kids to volunteer here?" Marilyn explained her vision. "They could learn about animals, responsibility, and have a safe place after school." Susan's enthusiasm encouraged her to reach out to more community leaders. By lunchtime, her inbox was full of supportive messages and offers to help. When Jacob arrived after school, Marilyn shared her idea. His eyes lit up immediately. "Could I help?" he asked eagerly. "I know what it's like to need somewhere to go." "Actually," Marilyn smiled, "I was hoping you'd be my first official volunteer. We need to make some posters to spread the word." Jacob pulled up a chair to Marilyn's desk, and together they designed bright, welcoming posters. He suggested adding pictures of animals and wrote about his own experience at the clinic. "Kids need to know it's okay to need help," Jacob said quietly as he colored in the letters. and that there are people who care. Word spread quickly through their small town. Parents started calling, sharing stories about their children's struggles, and expressing gratitude for the opportunity. The local coffee shop offered to display posters, and the library asked Marilyn to give a presentation about the program. "Look at all these responses." Marilyn showed Jacob the growing list of interested families. His face beamed with pride as he helped her organize the information. Together, they stood in front of the clinic's large front window. Marilyn held up their first completed poster, featuring a drawing of Whiskers and the words, "Find your place at Harper's Veterinary Clinic, Youth Volunteer Program." "Perfect," she said, carefully taping it to the window. Jacob stood beside her, his chest puffed out with pride. "We're really going to help other kids," he said, reaching down to scratch Whiskers, who had wandered over to investigate their work. Marilyn looked at the poster, then at Jacob, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. This was more than just expanding her business. It was about creating a haven where children could find purpose and belonging, just as Jacob had. The late afternoon sun streamed through the clinic windows as Jacob confidently moved between the kennels, checking water bowls and speaking softly to each animal. His movements were sure and gentle, a far cry from the timid boy who had burst through the doors with a limp cat in his arms just months ago. "Remember to check their charts twice," he instructed a new volunteer, a shy girl named Emma. "That's what Dr. Harper taught me." His voice carried a quiet authority that made Marilyn pause in her paperwork to watch the interaction. Emma nodded, carefully following Jacob's lead as he demonstrated how to properly document feeding times. Whiskers weaved between their legs, purring contentedly and occasionally pawing at Jacob's shoelaces. "You're doing great," Jacob encouraged Emma when she successfully completed her first chart. The smile he gave her was warm and genuine, the kind of smile that had been rare on his face when he first arrived. During quiet moments, Marilyn observed the subtle but significant changes in Jacob. He stood straighter now, met people's eyes when speaking, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was valued and needed. At home, things were changing too. Sarah had rearranged her work schedule to be home for dinner each evening. They sat at their small kitchen table, sharing meals and conversations that had once seemed impossible. Twice a week, they attended therapy sessions together, slowly unpacking their grief and learning to communicate again. "Mom made lasagna last night," Jacob told Marilyn as he organized supplies. "She remembered it was Dad's recipe, and we talked about him during dinner. It was sad, but good sad, you know." Marilyn nodded, understanding the healing that came with acknowledging loss while moving forward. She watched as Jacob paused to scratch Whiskers behind the ears, the cat arching into his touch with complete trust. The clinic had become livelier since Jacob started helping with the volunteer program. His natural empathy made him an excellent mentor to other children, showing them how to approach nervous animals and teaching them the importance of patience and gentleness. "Whiskers helps too," Jacob explained to a group of new volunteers. "Sometimes animals are scared because they've been hurt or lost. They just need to know they're safe now." The wisdom in his words reflected his own journey of healing. Sarah stopped by the clinic one afternoon, bringing sandwiches for Jacob's lunch break. As mother and son shared their meal in the break room, Marilyn noticed how Sarah leaned in when Jacob spoke, really listening as he described his morning helping with a nervous puppy. The distance that had once existed between them was slowly closing, replaced by genuine interest and affection. Whiskers had become something of a celebrity at the clinic, greeting visitors with friendly chirps and supervising the daily activities from various perches. But it was still Jacob the cat sought out most often, curling up in his lap during quiet moments or following him as he went about his tasks. The transformation in Jacob was most evident in these everyday moments, in his gentle confidence, his growing ability to connect with others, and the light that now shone in his eyes. He had found his place in the world, surrounded by the healing power of compassion, responsibility, and unconditional love. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the clinic windows as people filed in, carrying dishes of food and wearing bright smiles. Marilyn had transformed the waiting room into a cozy gathering space, with chairs arranged in rows and colorful streamers hanging from the ceiling. The smell of fresh-baked cookies and coffee filled the air. Jacob stood near the makeshift podium, fidgeting with his note cards. Whiskers lounged contentedly in a nearby carrier, watching the crowd with half-closed eyes. Sarah helped arrange refreshments, looking more relaxed than she had in months, the dark circles under her eyes finally fading. "You ready?" Marilyn asked Jacob softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. He nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think so. Just a little nervous." As the room filled with familiar faces from the neighborhood, Marilyn stepped up to welcome everyone. "Thank you all for coming today. What started as a simple act of kindness has grown into something truly special." When it was Jacob's turn to speak, his voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. "Before I found Whiskers, I felt really alone," he said, his eyes finding his mother in the crowd. "But bringing him to Dr. Harper's clinic changed everything." Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as Jacob continued, describing how caring for the animals had given him confidence and purpose. Mrs. Foster sat nearby, nodding along, her face glowing with pride. "Whiskers isn't just my cat anymore," Jacob explained. "He's helped other kids feel better, too. When new volunteers come to the clinic, he always knows exactly who needs extra attention." The audience chuckled as Whiskers meowed right on cue, drawing smiles from everyone. Mrs. Foster raised her hand to wave at Jacob, her eyes twinkling. "I want to thank Dr. Harper," Jacob said, turning to Marilyn. "She didn't just help me take care of Whiskers. She showed me that even when things seem really hard, there's always hope." Several parents approached Marilyn after Jacob's speech, asking about enrolling their children in the volunteer program. The clinic buzzed with conversation and laughter as people shared stories about their own experiences with the animals. Sarah hugged Jacob tightly. "I'm so proud of you, sweetie," she whispered. "Thank you for helping me understand what you needed." Marilyn watched from across the room as families mingled, volunteers chatted with newcomers, and children took turns peeking in at Whiskers. The clinic had become more than just a veterinary practice. It was a place of healing for everyone who walked through its doors. Mrs. Foster made her way to Jacob, her steps steadier than they had been months ago. "You've done such a wonderful job with Whiskers," she said, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Seeing you two together makes my heart happy." Looking around at the joyful gathering, Marilyn felt a deep sense of contentment. What had started with a frightened boy and an injured cat had blossomed into something beautiful, a community bound together by compassion, hope, and the simple power of caring. The evening sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Marilyn gathered her papers. The familiar sounds of filing cabinets and shuffling documents filling her office. In the reception area, Jacob's laughter mixed with Whiskers' playful meows, creating a melody that had become the soundtrack of their daily routine. "Come here, buddy," Jacob called out, dangling a string toy as Whiskers pounced and rolled. The cat's sleek fur caught the golden light, making him look almost magical. Marilyn paused her work, taking in the scene before her with a warm smile. She thought back to that rainy afternoon when Jacob had burst through her doors, clutching what he thought was a dead cat. Who could have known that moment would spark such profound changes? The memory stirred something deep within her, how a single act of kindness had rippled outward, touching so many lives. Marilyn's eyes drifted to the wall of photos that had slowly accumulated over the months. There was Jacob receiving his volunteer certificate, Sarah attending their first community event, Mrs. Foster visiting Whiskers with cookies she'd baked. Each image told a story of healing and growth. "Can I help you with anything else?" Jacob asked, appearing in her office doorway with Whiskers cradled in his arms. The timid boy who'd first entered her clinic was gone, replaced by a confident young person who stood tall and spoke clearly. "Actually," Marilyn said, setting down her pen, "I'd love some company while I finish these last few forms." Jacob settled into the chair across from her desk, Whiskers purring contentedly in his lap. "You know," he said, his voice soft but steady, "I never really thanked you properly. For everything, I mean. Not just Whiskers, but—" He paused, searching for the right words. "For believing in me, for helping Mom, for making things better." Marilyn felt her heart swell with emotion. "Oh, Jacob," she replied, reaching across the desk to squeeze his hand. "You've given me just as much as I've given you. Sometimes life has a way of bringing the right people together at exactly the right time." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound being Whiskers' steady purring. The cat's eyes were half closed in contentment, a far cry from the frightened creature they'd found months ago. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" Marilyn said, glancing between Jacob and Whiskers. "The best," Jacob agreed with a bright smile. As the last rays of sunlight painted the clinic walls in warm amber, Marilyn gathered her things and reached for her keys. She watched as Jacob gently set Whiskers down, the cat immediately weaving between his legs as they headed toward the door. Marilyn locked up the clinic, the familiar click of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet evening air. Ahead of her, Jacob and Whiskers walked side by side, their shadows stretching long behind them on the sidewalk. A smile spread across her face as she watched them go, their silhouettes painted against the setting sun. If you enjoyed the story of Marilyn, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.